There are homes that seem to hold money, and there are homes that quietly push it away, not through obvious disaster, not through dramatic ruin, but through something far more subtle, a tolerated object, a neglected corner, a sign of depletion that stays in place so long it stops being noticed. And that is where the problem begins, because in many old prosperity traditions, what remained in the home was never treated as neutral. Certain things were believed to carry a message. Some carried order, some carried dignity, some carried protection, and some carried loss. Across generations, families who were careful with prosperity understood that money was not only a matter of labor, talent, or opportunity. It was also a matter of atmosphere, of discipline, of what was allowed to sit near daily life without question. They watched the home closely. They paid attention to what was broken, what was leaking, what was decaying, what had outlived its purpose and yet remained. Because to them, these things did not simply take up space. They taught the eye to accept decline. They taught the mind to live beside deterioration. And over time, that has a cost. Most people never think this way now. They look at an old object and see inconvenience. They look at clutter and see delay. They look at something damaged, worn out, dried out, dead, forgotten, and they tell themselves they will deal with it later. Later becomes months, sometimes years. And all the while, the house begins to speak a language the owner no longer hears, a language of neglect, a language of unresolved energy. A language that says, without words, this is acceptable here. In many traditions, that mattered more than people realize. Ancient households did not separate prosperity from maintenance, from cleanliness, from placement, from restraint. They knew that what you keep around you shapes your inner standards, and your inner standards shape your financial life far more than most people admit. A person who grows used to brokenness in their surroundings often grows used to it in quieter places too, in delayed decisions, in careless spending, in money left unmanaged, in responsibilities postponed, in the slow normalization of waste. This is why some objects were treated with caution, not because old families were naive, not because they believed every hardship came from a chair, a mirror, a plant, a crack, or a forgotten pile in the corner, but because they understood symbolism. They understood that human beings live by signals more than they think. What surrounds you is never just outside you. It enters your attention, it enters your habits, it enters your sense of what is normal. And once something unhealthy becomes normal, it becomes expensive. Stay with me, because this is where it gets deeper. The object itself is only part of the story. The larger issue is what it represents. Some things in a house begin to stand for stagnation. Some begin to stand for depletion. Some quietly suggest that what is drained can remain, what is broken can remain, what has lost its life can remain, what weakens the space can remain. And once the home begins to carry that message, prosperity rarely feels settled there. It may enter for a moment, then leave. It may arrive through effort, then disappear through carelessness, delay, surprise expenses, poor timing, or decisions made in a fog. Many people call that bad luck. Older wisdom was less sentimental. It treated these patterns as warnings, warnings that something in the environment had begun to mirror something in the person, something unaddressed, something tolerated too long, something that should have been removed before it started shaping the emotional tone of the household. And this is what changes everything. Prosperity is not only invited, it is protected. That protection is not always dramatic. Sometimes it begins with a decision so ordinary most people would overlook it. To remove what drains, to clear what weakens, to stop living beside symbols of decline and then asking why financial life feels heavy, delayed, or unsettled. So before you dismiss this as a small matter, look again. Because the item we are about to discuss is often kept in plain sight. People pass by it every day. They stop seeing it. They stop feeling its message, but the home does not. The nervous system does not. Habit does not. And in many old teachings, neither does money. In many old households, prosperity was never treated as something that arrived and took care of itself. It had to be guarded. Not guarded only through savings, trade, skill, or discipline, though all of those mattered. It was also guarded through standards, through what was allowed to remain in the home, through what was repaired quickly, what was removed without hesitation, what was kept clean, what was placed with care, and what was never ignored for too long. This was not random behavior. It came from a deeper understanding that a house is never just a shelter. It becomes a mirror of what a family is willing to notice, tolerate, respect, and protect. And that is why some objects were never considered harmless. Modern thinking often separates things too aggressively. Money is seen as one category, the home as another, emotion as another, behavior as another. Old wisdom did not make that mistake. It recognized that financial life is shaped by atmosphere as much as effort, by emotional tone as much as numbers, by what surrounds a person daily as much as by what they claim to value in theory. A family could speak about wanting stability and yet live among signs of disorder. They could say they wanted increase while allowing visible decline to sit undisturbed for months. They could hope for financial relief while normalizing neglect in the very space where life unfolded. Older traditions paid attention to that contradiction. In some Jewish households, in certain Chinese household beliefs, in old Mediterranean family customs, and in many ancestral systems that linked home order with prosperity, the condition of one's surroundings was never trivial. A broken thing was not always just broken. A neglected thing was not always just forgotten. Sometimes it was treated as a message, sometimes as a warning, sometimes as proof that attention had gone weak. And when attention goes weak, money rarely stays strong for long. That is one of the oldest hidden rules around prosperity. Wealth does not only respond to ambition, it responds to stewardship. And stewardship begins before the wallet, before the account, before the deal, before the income increase. It begins with what a person respects enough to correct. Most people don't notice this because they have been trained to think in isolated compartments. They imagine that a damaged object in the house has no relationship to financial life unless it causes direct expense. But that is a shallow reading. The deeper cost is symbolic, emotional, and behavioral. Every unresolved object teaches something. Every ignored sign of decline sends a quiet instruction into the mind. This can stay. This can wait. This is not urgent. This does not need to be handled now. That attitude rarely remains confined to the object. It spreads. It touches bills, decisions, conversations, opportunities, maintenance, timing, boundaries. It enters the entire rhythm of a person's life. What begins as tolerance in one corner often becomes passivity in others. And this is where ancient people were sharper than many modern people. They knew that the home trains the mind. A cracked container left untouched, a dead object left in view, a leaking fixture that continues for weeks, a drawer full of broken things kept just in case. None of these are only practical issues. They shape perception, they lower standards, they make neglect feel ordinary. And once neglect feels ordinary, financial leakage often stops feeling shocking too. This is why wise families often acted quickly, not out of superstition, out of understanding. They understood that prosperity needs a certain kind of environment, not luxury, not perfection, but clarity, respect, order, life, intention. They knew that abundance struggles in spaces where depletion is constantly being excused, because over time, the house begins to reflect a deeper truth. People do not only live in their home, they are being trained by it. And this is where the matter becomes personal. Look at what remains around you that should have been dealt with already. Look at what your eye has become too used to. Look at what once bothered you but now barely registers. In many old teachings, that numbness was dangerous. It meant the household had adapted to a lower standard without realizing it. And when a person adapts to a lower standard in their surroundings, they often do the same in their finances. They accept what should have been corrected. They delay what should have been decided. They tolerate what should have been removed. So before we even name the object at the center of this discussion, the deeper lesson must be understood first. Prosperity is sensitive to what a household silently agrees to live beside. And this is what most people get wrong. They think wealth is driven away only by major mistakes, major losses, major failures. But across generations, many families believed something quieter than that. They believed prosperity often begins to retreat long before disaster, when small signs of decay are allowed to stay and shape the emotional climate of daily life. That is why some objects were never treated as decoration, inconvenience, or background. They were treated as indicators, and what they indicated mattered. If old prosperity teachings were cautious about anything, they were cautious about decay. Not simply because decay looks unpleasant, because decay changes the meaning of a space. A home can be modest and still feel protected. It can be simple and still feel dignified. It can be small and still feel aligned, clean, deliberate, and alive. But once visible neglect begins to settle in, something shifts, the atmosphere weakens, the message changes. And in many ancestral systems, that change was taken seriously. Brokenness that remains broken does not stay silent. It starts speaking on behalf of the household. a chipped object that should have been replaced, a dead plant still sitting in the same corner, a clock that no longer runs, a leaking tap allowed to drip for months, torn fabric, damaged frames, cracked containers, spoiled storage, drawers filled with useless fragments, objects that clearly belong to a past season of life and yet continue to occupy present space. These things may seem ordinary, but across generations they were often read as signs that something had lost its rightful order. And this is where the financial symbolism becomes stronger. Decay suggests loss without closure. Breakage suggests interruption without repair. Neglect suggests responsibility without action. That combination quietly teaches the mind to live in unfinished conditions. It lowers sensitivity. It makes unresolved things feel normal. And once a person becomes emotionally comfortable with unresolved things, money often begins to follow the same pattern. Payments are delayed, small leaks are ignored, agreements are left vague, expenses go unexamined, waste becomes routine. Not all at once, quietly, gradually, the same way disorder takes over a room, one tolerated item at a time. This is why many old households reacted quickly to visible decline. A broken object was not always kept around just because it might still be useful. People understood that usefulness is not the only question. Sometimes the deeper question is this: what is this object teaching the people who live beside it every day? A dead plant is a strong example. Most people see it and think only of forgetfulness. Perhaps there was no time, perhaps it slipped the mind, but in symbolic traditions tied to prosperity, dead living things carried a heavier meaning. Something that once held life now displays depletion. Something that once grew now stands as a small monument to neglect. Left there long enough, it begins to say something unfortunate about the household. What weakens here is allowed to remain in view. That matters more than it seems, because the eye adapts quickly. At first, a person notices the dead leaves, the dry stems, the lifeless soil. A week later, they notice it less. A month later, it becomes part of the room. This is how decline hides. Not by becoming invisible, but by becoming familiar. And once familiarity removes discomfort, action slows down. The same thing happens in financial life. The problem is seen, then normalized, then tolerated, then woven into routine. Older wisdom treated that progression with suspicion. Not every broken thing had to be feared, but things that clearly represented stagnation, leakage, depletion, or unresolved deterioration were rarely left unexamined. Families understood that prosperity prefers movement with order. It prefers renewal over silent decline. It prefers repair, removal, or restoration over passive coexistence with damage. And there is another layer here that most people overlook. Neglected objects do not only signal passivity, they also consume attention, even when you think they do not. The mind is constantly scanning the environment. It registers what is out of place, what is unfinished, what is weak, what no longer belongs. A person may not consciously think about the cracked vase or the dead plant or the broken lamp each day, but part of the nervous system still absorbs the message. Something here is unresolved. Something here has been left to decline. Something here does not receive care. Over time, that has emotional consequences. It can create a low-grade feeling of heaviness in a room, a subtle drain, a sense that the home is carrying unfinished business. And when that feeling is repeated across multiple objects, corners, and surfaces, it begins to affect the rhythm of the people living there. Energy becomes scattered, attention becomes thinner, decisions become slower, standards quietly fall. This is where the problem begins, not with one object alone, but with the accumulation of tolerated signals that weaken clarity. Many people think they need more money when what they really need first is a stronger refusal. A refusal to keep what clearly represents depletion. A refusal to let brokenness define the visual language of the home. A refusal to make peace with signs that something has lost its life, its purpose, or its dignity. Because whether taken symbolically or psychologically, the message is the same. What you repeatedly allow shapes what you eventually accept. And this is why ancient families often feared disorder and decay more than temporary lack. Temporary lack can be answered with discipline, timing, labor, and wise decisions. But a home that begins to normalize decline is more dangerous because it slowly weakens the very mindset required to rebuild. So before thinking only about income, look at what your home has been quietly asking you to confront. What has broken and remained? What has dried out and stayed on display? What has stopped working and yet continues to occupy space? What has clearly ended and yet has not been removed? These are not small questions. In old prosperity teachings, they were often the beginning of much larger ones, because the issue was never only the object, it was the standard the object revealed. And once that standard slips, money often slips with it. If decay weakens a home, disorder confuses it. And confusion is expensive. This is something many old households understood with unusual clarity. They did not always speak in the language of productivity or psychology, but they understood the effect. A room filled with disorder does not merely look unsettled. It trains the mind to scatter. It weakens attention. It makes decision-making heavier than it should be. And once attention is weakened, prosperity becomes harder to protect. That is why disorder was rarely treated as a small domestic issue in old prosperity traditions. It was treated as drift, not dramatic collapse. Drift, the slow loss of structure, the quiet permission of excess, the failure to decide what belongs, what does not, what should stay, what should be repaired, what should be thrown away, what should be moved, what should be cleared. This may sound ordinary, but in many ancestral systems, drift was dangerous because wealth is rarely lost only through one catastrophic event. More often, it slips away through repeated small failures of attention, a cluttered surface, a drawer that no longer closes properly because it is packed with useless things, corners filled with forgotten objects, storage areas carrying old fragments of past intentions, past projects, past purchases, past identities. Nothing resolved. Nothing fully released, nothing fully ordered. And over time, the home begins to feel dense, not necessarily chaotic in an obvious way, just heavy. Heavy with unfinished decisions, heavy with delayed judgment, heavy with things that no longer serve, yet continue to occupy space, as if they still have a claim on the household. This is where disorder becomes more than visual. It becomes behavioral, because every form of clutter is, at some level, a postponed choice. And postponed choices have a way of multiplying. A person who delays decisions in the home often begins to delay them elsewhere too. Financial paperwork sits unopened. Small recurring charges go unchecked. Purchases remain unexamined. Accounts become disorganized. Important conversations are postponed. Waste hides in the folds of inattention. This is why some traditions linked household disorder with financial leakage. Not because scattered objects magically repel money, because scattered environments often produce scattered stewardship. A person may be intelligent, capable, hard-working, even ambitious, and still lose ground because their attention is being constantly drained by the low-grade friction of disorder. They spend more time looking for things, more energy stepping around unfinished spaces, more mental effort tolerating what should have been addressed. The result is subtle, but it adds up. And prosperity rarely thrives where energy is endlessly being siphoned into managing preventable confusion. Most people don't notice this because disorder grows slowly. A table becomes a holding place. A shelf becomes a graveyard of maybe later. A hallway corner becomes a temporary resting place for things without a home. Then the temporary becomes permanent, and the room begins to teach a dangerous lesson. Ambiguity can remain. Old families were wary of that lesson. They knew that homes should not be full of undecided things, because undecided things pull on the mind. They ask for attention without giving anything back. They create visual noise, emotional noise, and eventually financial noise. When too many things in a home remain undefined, unresolved, or uncontained, the people living there often begin to feel the same way inside. Their sense of control weakens, their standards soften, their willingness to confront small problems declines. And that is exactly how money begins to leak. Not always through great foolishness, sometimes through exhaustion, through lack of clarity, through the emotional drag of too many unattended details. In old prosperity teachings, this is why order carried moral weight. Order was not vanity, it was not obsession, it was not sterile perfection, it was respect. Respect for the home, respect for the tools of daily life, respect for the mind's need for clarity, respect for what prosperity requires in order to remain steady. A clean, ordered home tells the nervous system something important. Things are being watched, things are being handled, things are not being left to drift indefinitely. That message matters, especially to a person trying to rebuild financially, especially to someone who feels money comes in and disappears, especially to someone whose efforts are real, but whose results never seem to settle. Because in many cases, the problem is not only the income, it is the environment in which attention is being trained every day. And this is where older wisdom becomes sharper than modern advice. Modern culture often encourages accumulation without discernment. More storage, more containers, more hidden piles, more things kept for someday. But old households understood that keeping too much, especially what has no purpose, can quietly weaken the spirit of stewardship. It fills the home with residue, with indecision, with stale attachment, with silent fatigue. In many traditions, stagnant corners were taken seriously for this reason. The corner no one touches, the shelf no one revisits, the cupboard full of objects nobody uses, nobody loves, nobody needs, and yet nobody removes. These spaces may seem harmless, but they often become small monuments to avoidance. They hold not only objects, but deferred responsibility. And deferred responsibility always carries a cost. Stay with me, because this is where it becomes even more revealing. Prosperity does not only ask what you are trying to gain, it asks what you are willing to clear. That question unsettles people more than they expect, because gaining feels hopeful, clearing feels personal, clearing forces honesty. Why is this still here? Why have I allowed this to remain? What am I postponing by keeping this unresolved? What part of my life has started to resemble this same pattern? These are the kinds of questions that old systems quietly embedded into domestic order. They understood that cleaning a space could also expose a habit. Releasing an object could also break a pattern. Restoring order in a room could begin restoring order in thought, attention, and money. And this is why disorder drains more than peace. It drains sharpness, it drains standards, it drains follow-through, it drains the invisible strength required to hold prosperity once it arrives. A disordered home does not merely reflect a scattered life. Over time, it helps produce one. That is why wise households did not wait endlessly. They cleared, they sorted, they repaired, they removed. Not because they worshipped tidiness, but because they understood a deeper law. What remains around you is teaching you how to live. And if what remains is unresolved, excessive, stale, and undefined, it will eventually begin teaching you how to mismanage more than space. Now we can name it. One of the clearest objects many old households would not keep in the home for long is a dead plant. Not a medicinal herb properly dried with purpose. Not flowers intentionally preserved for memory or ritual. A dead plant left sitting where life is supposed to move. A pot of dry soil, brittle leaves, collapsed stems. A thing that once required care, once responded to light and water, once carried growth, and now remains only as evidence of neglect. This is the kind of object many traditions would have treated with caution, especially in a home where people were praying for relief, trying to rebuild financially, or hoping for greater stability. Because the symbolism is too direct to ignore. A dead plant is not merely decoration gone bad. It is visible depletion. It is stalled life in plain sight. It is something that was meant to grow, left in a state of quiet decline, and then normalized by everyone who walks past it. That is why it matters. In prosperity-minded traditions, living things inside the home were often associated with vitality, movement, blessing, renewal, and responsive care. A healthy plant was not magic, but it carried a message. Life is being maintained here. Attention is present here. Growth is welcome here. A dead plant carries the opposite message. Life has receded here. Care has lapsed here. Decline can remain here without being addressed. And this is where most people get it wrong. They assume the issue is aesthetic. It is not. It is relational. A dead plant is one of the most revealing household objects because it exposes a pattern so many people live with. They stop responding to what is clearly asking for action. First, the leaves begin to yellow, then they dry, then the plant bends, weakens, collapses. At every stage there was a chance to intervene, water it, move it, revive it, remove it. But when none of those things happen, the final result becomes more than an object. It becomes a record of delayed care. And records matter, not only in documents, accounts, and agreements, in the emotional field of the home as well. Every time you pass a dead plant, some part of you registers the unfinished message. Something here once needed attention and did not receive it. Something here crossed the line from life into neglect and was allowed to stay. That may sound small, but the mind absorbs patterns through repetition. A dead plant quietly rehearses a dangerous permission. Deterioration can sit in the room and nothing needs to be done. That permission is expensive. Because once a person becomes too comfortable with that message in one area, they often become more tolerant of it elsewhere. A charge that should have been cancelled stays active. A repair gets postponed. A budget gets ignored. A drawer of paperwork remains unsorted. A financial truth that should be confronted gets pushed another week, then another month. What changes is not just behavior, it is threshold. The threshold for what feels urgent rises. The threshold for action weakens. And prosperity does not thrive where thresholds are weak. This is why, in many old homes, objects that visibly represented depletion were removed quickly, not out of panic, out of respect. Respect for the tone of the household, respect for the standards being modeled, respect for the idea that the home should not become a gallery of what has died and remained. There is another reason dead plants carry such weight. They distort the meaning of stillness. A healthy home has stillness. A peaceful room can be quiet, restrained, simple, even sparse. That is not a problem, but a dead plant is not peaceful stillness. It is arrested life. It is not calm. It is aftermath. And when aftermath is left sitting in a place meant for living, the room begins to carry a faint emotional contradiction. It looks settled, but feels tired. It appears decorated, but holds loss. It occupies space meant for growth while representing the end of growth. That contradiction is felt more than people realize, especially near workspaces, dining areas, entrances, bedrooms and corners people see every day. And that is why older teachings often paid close attention to objects at the threshold of life and death. Fresh food versus spoiled food. Clean water versus stagnant water, flame versus ash, living growth versus dead growth. These contrasts mattered because they were understood as symbolic languages. A home was always communicating something. Either it was aligned with continuity, care, and renewal, or it was slowly making peace with depletion. A neglected dead plant almost always belongs to the second category, and here is the harder part. Many people keep it because they do not want to admit what it says. Removing it feels like acknowledging a lapse. It forces a simple, uncomfortable truth. This was left too long. That is precisely why the object is powerful. It reveals where embarrassment, delay, and avoidance have quietly joined hands. It shows the point where a person would rather adjust to decline than act decisively. But wealth has never been protected that way. Wise families did not become strong by emotionally adapting to what was clearly weakening the space. They became strong by learning to recognize when an object had crossed from useful into symbolic burden. And once it crossed that line, they acted quietly, cleanly, without debate. So if there is a dead plant in your home, the real question is not whether plants are mystical. The real question is why a sign of lifelessness has been allowed to remain in a place where you are asking life to increase. That is the contradiction. That is the warning. And in many old teachings, contradictions like that were never ignored for long. Once a dead plant has been recognized for what it is, the next step matters. Not just that it is removed, but how. Old households often understood something modern people forget. An action changes you more deeply when it is done with awareness. That is why many simple household acts once carried quiet ceremony: sweeping, washing, opening shutters in the morning, clearing a table before evening, folding things properly, repairing what could be repaired, removing what should no longer remain. These were not grand rituals. They were small acts of order that trained the inner life. And this is the right spirit in which to remove a dead plant, not with panic, not with theatrical fear, not as though the object has cursed the house. That kind of thinking weakens judgment. The wiser approach is calmer than that, more sober, more exact. You remove it because you are ending an agreement with visible depletion, an agreement with tolerated neglect, an agreement with the slow habit of passing by what should have been handled. That is why the moment of removal can become meaningful. First, stop and look at it honestly. Do not rush past the recognition. Let the object say what it has been saying all along. Something once alive was left too long without response. Something weakened and remained. Something lost its place in the home, yet stayed in the home anyway. That is the truth of it. There is no need to dramatize it, but there is also no need to soften it. Then remove it fully, not halfway. Not by moving it to another corner, another room, another hidden shelf, another balcony where it can continue existing in a lesser form. That is only relocation, not release. Old wisdom understood this well. What weakens the tone of the home should not simply be displaced, it should be concluded. This is where many people fail without noticing. They move the symbol of neglect out of sight, but they do not break the pattern that created it. They treat the object as the whole problem. It is not. The object is the evidence. The real work is to restore a stronger standard. So as you remove it, do one more thing. clear the space it occupied. Wipe the surface. Clean the floor beneath it. Open a window if there is one nearby. Let air move through the room. Do not leave behind the dust ring, the dry leaves, the residue in the tray, the faint outline of where decline was sitting. Finish the act properly. Old families understood that incomplete clearing leaves incomplete signals. A thing removed but not fully cleaned still leaves part of its message behind. And this is the moment for a small phrase, not as magic, as instruction, as a line that restores inner authority. Quietly, either aloud or within yourself, say, "My home does not keep what drains it." Simple, clear, exact. That phrase matters because it goes beyond the plant. It begins to name a law. My home does not keep what drains it. Not dead growth, not visible neglect, not stale disorder, not unresolved depletion treated as background scenery. The phrase gives language to a boundary many people have never consciously formed. That is why old sayings, blessings, and household phrases mattered across cultures. They helped turn values into memory. They made standards easier to repeat and easier to live by. A family that repeats nothing eventually stands for very little. But a home with clear phrases begins to shape clear behavior. My home does not keep what drains it. Stay with that for a moment, because this is where the ritual becomes larger than the object. A person can remove a dead plant and still live in the same pattern, but a person who removes it while understanding the meaning may begin changing other things almost immediately. A stack of unpaid attention near the entryway, a broken item kept out of inertia, a corner filled with stale clutter, a drawer of dead tools, dead batteries, dead intentions. Suddenly, these things no longer feel harmless. They begin to reveal themselves as small negotiations with depletion. And this is what changes everything. Prosperity is not protected only by what you add. Sometimes it is protected first by what you stop housing. That is a harder lesson than most people expect, because addition feels hopeful. Buying something new, starting something new, chasing more income, waiting for a better opportunity. But many households do not need a new symbol before they remove the wrong one. They do not need more before they restore dignity to what already exists. That is why the quiet ritual of removal has force. It restores authorship. It tells the mind, I notice what is weakening this place. I act on what I notice. I do not adapt endlessly to decline. I do not ask blessing to live beside what I refuse to correct. There is deep dignity in that, and dignity has always mattered around money, not vanity, not display. Dignity, the dignity to keep the home honest, the dignity to refuse what has become lifeless, the dignity to make space for order before demanding increase. In many old traditions, that sequence was understood instinctively. Clear first, then guard, then build, then receive. People now often reverse it. They try to receive while refusing to clear. They ask for abundance while continuing to house its opposite. They hope for relief while remaining visually, emotionally, and behaviorally surrounded by signs of unresolved depletion. A dead plant is small, yes, but what it represents is not small at all. That is why removing it consciously can mark the beginning of something larger. Not because the house becomes magically transformed overnight, but because the person living in it stops rehearsing tolerance for what drains the space. And once that rehearsal stops, stronger patterns can begin. What changes after something like this is removed is not always visible in dramatic ways. Usually, it begins more quietly. The room feels lighter, but not because of decoration. The corner feels clearer, but not because it has become impressive. What changes first is subtler than appearance. A standard has been restored. A silent permission has been withdrawn. The home is no longer agreeing to keep a sign of depletion in plain sight and call it normal. That matters, because homes are always teaching. They teach through repetition, through what is seen every morning, through what is walked past at night, through what is handled, ignored, repaired, wiped down, put away, replaced, or left in decline. People think they are simply living inside their house. Often the house is shaping them back. So when a home stops protecting what weakens it, a shift begins in the person as much as in the space. The eye sharpens, the threshold lowers again. Things that had been excused start becoming visible in a new way. A drawer that has been functioning as a graveyard for useless objects. A torn item kept out of habit. A broken tool no one repairs, but no one releases. A stagnant corner that has not been touched in months. A pile of old papers tied to decisions never finished. These things suddenly feel louder, even though they are silent. And the reason they feel louder is simple. Once one symbol of decline is removed consciously, the mind becomes less willing to live numb beside others. This is why older families often understood prosperity as a matter of vigilance, not fear. Vigilance, a watchfulness that protects against subtle erosion. They did not wait for major collapse before correcting the tone of the home. They knew that major collapse often has small rehearsals long before it arrives. Small tolerated signs, small lapses in care, small permissions granted to disorder, stagnation, and unresolved things. By the time money begins disappearing in obvious ways, the environment has often been telling the story for a while. That is the harder truth. People often ask why prosperity feels blocked, delayed, unstable, or unable to remain. They look for one event, one enemy, one unlucky season, one external explanation. Sometimes those things are real, but sometimes the answer is more intimate. The home itself has been carrying contradictions. The person has been asking for increase while rehearsing tolerance for what signals decline, asking for flow while living beside stagnation, asking for protection while refusing to remove what weakens the atmosphere of the place. And money is rarely comfortable in contradiction, not for long. This is where ancient teachings remain so sharp. They remind us that prosperity is not merely attracted by desire. It is stabilized by standards, by restraint, by maintenance, by the refusal to normalize what drains the life of the household. This is why many old homes, even when simple, carried a sense of dignity. Things had a place. What was broken did not remain forever. What had died was not displayed casually. What weakened the tone of the home was dealt with before it became part of the visual language of daily life. That was wisdom, and it still is. Because whether you speak in the language of symbolism, psychology, household order, or moral discipline, the principle remains the same. What you keep around you helps shape what you become able to tolerate. And what you tolerate eventually touches your finances, your timing, your judgment, your energy, and your sense of what deserves attention. So when a home stops protecting what weakens it, prosperity is not guaranteed overnight. But something necessary begins, clarity begins, respect begins, a stronger inner posture begins. The house starts saying something different. Not loss can remain here. Not depletion may stay here unnoticed. But this place is watched. This place is tended. This place is not in silent agreement with what drains it. That kind of message has force. It changes how a person enters the room. It changes how they make decisions. It changes what they delay and what they address. It changes the emotional standard from which financial life is lived. And that is why old families were often less concerned with appearance than with condition. They understood that prosperity has little patience for houses full of unresolved signals. It is not luxury that steadies wealth, it is order, not expensive decoration, attention, not performance, care. A home becomes stronger when it stops protecting what weakens it. A person becomes stronger too, because every removal of visible depletion is also a decision about identity. I am no longer the person who walks past this and does nothing. I am no longer the person who adapts endlessly to decline. I am no longer the keeper of what has clearly lost its place. That is not a small shift. That is the beginning of stewardship. And stewardship has always sat near prosperity more faithfully than desire ever could. So if this message stays with you, let it stay in a practical way. Look around your home with steadier eyes. Notice what has become too familiar. Notice what your attention stopped questioning. Notice where the atmosphere has been shaped by things that should have been concluded, cleared, repaired, or released. The dead plant may have been the first sign. It is rarely the only one, but the first sign is enough, because once you are willing to see one contradiction clearly, you become more capable of removing others. And that is how many old systems believed wealth was protected, not only by what entered the house, by what the house refused to keep. Let me leave you with something. If this resonated with you, if some part of you recognized that your home may be asking for a clearer standard, then go to the comments and write this: My home does not keep what drains it, not as decoration, as a decision.